I'm Matthew James, a nephrologist and health services researcher at the University of Calgary. In this presentation, I will use the HDRN Canada Pragmatic Trials Training Program curriculum wheel to describe elements of our trial, effects of clinical decision support with audit and feedback on prevention of acute kidney injury in patients undergoing coronary angiography, a stepped wedge cluster randomized trial, also known as the contrast risk trial. Intent and question. Our intent was to implement and evaluate an evidence-based, multifaceted intervention for the prevention of acute kidney injury after coronary angiography or percutaneous coronary intervention across all cardiac catheterization centers in Alberta, Canada. Our question was, what is the effectiveness of clinical decision support accompanied by audit and feedback to physicians for prevention of acute kidney injury in patients undergoing these procedures? Our trial design was a stepped wedge, cluster randomized clinical trial conducted in Alberta, Canada. We included all invasive cardiologists in each of the 3 cardiac catheterization laboratories who were randomized to various start dates to receive the intervention between January 2018 and September 2019. This figure illustrates the step wedge cluster randomized design. In this design, clusters of physicians, all invasive cardiologists, between 3 to 6 per cluster, were randomized to varying dates to start receiving the intervention. As illustrated in this figure, at the beginning of the trial, no physicians or patients under their care are exposed to the intervention, and as time proceeds, more physicians and patients begin being exposed to the intervention. By the end of the trial, all physicians and patients under their care are being exposed to the intervention. Implementation and impact. The intervention involved cardiologists who received educational outreach, computerized clinical decision support on contrast volume and hemodynamic guided intravenous targets, and audit and feedback. The control or pre-intervention group involved cardiologists who provided usual care and did not receive the intervention. The trial was designed with the primary outcome of the incidence of acute kidney injury. The secondary outcomes included process of care outcomes. Because the intervention focused on reducing contrast volume and improving the delivery of intravenous fluids as the prevention strategies for acute kidney injury, we measured the proportion of patients where the contrast limit recommendation was exceeded and the proportion of patients where insufficient IV fluid was delivered according to the left ventricular end diastolic pressure-based recommendations. Secondary clinical outcomes were major adverse cardiovascular events and major adverse kidney events, which were measured from the date of procedure up to 1 year afterwards. Our implementation approach was guided by the COM-B model for behavior change, standing for capacity, opportunity, motivation, behavior. We hypothesized that multiple components that were grounded in implementation science principles could work synergistically to address capacity, opportunity, and motivation of interventional cardiologists to change their practice. Education and decision support provided interventional cardiologists with the capability to improve use of prevention strategies. Decision support tools provided at the point of care when procedures are being performed and decisions are being made provided an opportunity to change these behaviors, and this was further reinforced through audit and feedback. And audit and feedback, particularly when provided in a reflective manner, providing the ability to observe your processes of care, compare them over time and to other colleagues, provides additional motivation. And these 3 elements can promote better care and outcomes, specifically prevention approaches for acute kidney injury. Statistics. Because of the cluster randomized design of this trial, we used multi-level logistic regression to estimate the odds ratios and 95% confidence intervals for categorical outcomes, and mixed effects linear regression is used to estimate mean differences with 95% confidence intervals for the continuous outcome. The stepped wedge cluster randomized design has implications for the statistical analysis of the trial. First, because increasing numbers of physicians and patients become exposed to the intervention over time, there is a need to adjust for time as a potential confounder. This was achieved by including time by calendar month as a fixed effects in the multivariable models. Furthermore, within the study, we have 3 hospital sites within which there are groups of physicians clustered within 3 to 6 practice groups, and within each physician, there are patients under their care. Furthermore, one patient may undergo more than one procedure during the course of the study, and thus we used random effects for site, physician, and patient to account for the correlations within these clusters. Furthermore, missing data was imputed using multiple imputation with 20 imputed data sets for the main analyses and complete case analysis and sensitivity analysis. Our multivariable models were further adjusted for fixed effects of patient age, sex, diabetes, heart failure, EGFR, and procedure indications. Ethics, consent, and regulations. All physicians provided informed consent to participate in this study, including for the audit and feedback process. However, we obtained a waiver of patient consent granted by the Universities of Calgary and the University of Alberta Research Ethics Boards. This was justified because the intervention was directed at physicians and ultimately under the control of these physicians. The design, which was targeted through decision support tools and audit and feedback provided to the physicians, precluded patients from opting out of the intervention. The intervention also promoted an evidence-based set of practices, and the risk to patients was deemed to be low. Trial materials. For the support staff in the cath laboratories, including nurses, educators, physiology and radiology technicians, we worked together to develop site-specific protocols which were tailored to the resources, infrastructure, and workforce composition in each site. We developed instructional videos which complemented in-person educational sessions, as well as cheat sheets and frequently asked questions documents to help guide staff and remind them on how to use decision support tools. For the invasive cardiologists, we developed a continuum medical education presentation and slide sets that were delivered one-on-one through the local champions to each invasive cardiologist as they began to receive the intervention. These were also captured in a video presentation that was made available subsequently. Another component of the study was the point of care decision support tool itself, which was a resource that was always available at the time and place of decision making during procedures in the cath lab, as well as the audit and feedback reports, which were delivered along with CME credit every 3 months to invasive cardiologists, and all materials were made available through our website. Partnerships and support. Our project was one of 6 innovation projects within the Alberta Health Services Cardiovascular Health and Stroke Strategic Clinical Network. This organization helped bring our project research team into close collaboration with health system, operational staff, and leadership in order to implement the project. Strong relationships with leadership in each of the cardiac catheterization unit was also critical to the success of the project. We partnered with the medical leads in each of the cardiac catheterization unit, as well as nursing, quality improvement, and educational leads in these centers. We also had project champions from each center who interacted with our cardiac providers in each center as well as the research team to help implement the project successfully. Indigenous rights and data sovereignty. Our trial did not collect information on indigeneity, and the effects of the intervention on Indigenous peoples was not assessed. Principles of data ownership, control, access, and possession are required for research with Indigenous peoples in Alberta. Our team members completed CanSolve CKD Network's Indigenous Learning Pathway to incorporate cultural safe health research practices, and we are applying these learnings in our subsequent work. Quality control and oversight. Continuous auditing, reporting, and training was conducted on the decision support tool use in the cardiac catheterization units, the recording of contrast volume in the approach registry, the recording of intravenous fluid use in the approach registry and electronic medical records, and the frequency of creatinine testing according to the trial protocol. These figures show some of the displays that were created to feed back to each cardiac catheterization unit on their data completion and recording in each of these areas. The top left shows the increasing completion of the clinical decision support tool as the trial was initiated. On the right, we see the recording of contrast dye volume in the approach system with each procedure across phases of the trial. And the circles along the bottom show the proportion of patients completing creatinine testing during follow-up according to the protocol at each of the 3 sites. Data. Data to measure outcomes from the trial was collected from a number of sources. The first was the clinical information system in the cardiac catheterization units called Approach. This system provided detailed information about the procedures, the care received, and outcomes. A unique aspect of this trial is that because we used the same system to implement the decision support recommendations, as well as capture and measure process of care outcomes, we were able to directly compare care received to that recommended by our decision support tools. Data was augmented from routinely collected health administrative databases, including the provincial lab database in Alberta, including all creatinine measurements needed to identify acute kidney injury, the hospital discharge abstract database to identify cardiovascular and kidney events, and hospital electronic medical record systems, which were used to identify intravenous fluid orders and administration. We augmented this with a limited amount of primary data collection, including a cath lab staff survey, a physician survey, and a patient experience survey to understand the experiences of healthcare providers and patients participating in the study. Interestingly, in this study, data analytics are part of our intervention. Usually, data is collected in studies. It is analyzed, maybe using predictive models. These findings are then reported back in periodic reports or publications. However, we know that this form of knowledge translation can be very slow and does not often immediately permeate into clinical practice. In our study, we used information from predictive models prospectively through risk prediction models and decision support tools that use data to prospectively inform an individual's care. This requires clinical information systems that enable delivery of data and analytics into the health system at point of care. And so in our study, data was part of the intervention, as well as used to evaluate its effectiveness. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. A diverse group of patient advisors, clinicians, decision makers, and researchers were all engaged in all stages of this project. Trial resources were created using a human-centered approach and reviewed with care providers and patients to ensure they were highly accessible. We used a broad recruitment strategy from all sites in the province based on risk and with few exclusion criteria to maximize inclusion and maximize generalizability of our findings. Financing and resources. Financing was provided by Alberta Innovates, a partnership for research and innovation in the health system grant. Following the completion of this grant and our trial, we obtained funding from Alberta Innovates through a Health Innovation Implementation and Spread grant to sustain this intervention and scale it to new physicians and cath labs entering the province and ensure it was implemented in a new clinical information system implemented across the health system in Alberta. We leveraged resources from the Alberta Provincial Project in Outcome Assessment in Coronary Heart Disease, in particular their clinical information system in the cardiac catheterization units and registry, in order to collect data for the trial and implement the clinical decision support tools. Collaborators were from the Interdisciplinary Chronic Disease Collaboration, who brought expertise in implementation science to the project, and the Alberta Health Services, Cardiovascular Health, and Strategic Clinical Network was an important partner between our research group and the operational groups within the health system.